for the story, I've been doxxed by Sotheby's on my first day at work. So since then, I've been pretty much showing my face because it didn't give me a choice there. So there's no point of trying to preserve my non-existent anonymity anymore.
I don't know if you're comfortable about mentioning them, but for me, as a background, I remember you mentioned that I think you were like on a boat for a long time with your family. Is it correct?
Greenland, I've lived on the boat and I'm happy to talk about it from pretty much since I was 7 or 8 until I was 13, 14. And it's very unique because this boat is called the World, Residence at Sea, and it's more than just a boat, it's like a DAO on a boat. There's like 200 residents that own an apartment on a cruise ship, and based on the number of meters square they have, they can vote in assembly for pretty much any decision related to the boat. So in itself, it's a pretty interesting governance type of initiative. And yeah, because of that, I've pretty much, I've been, I think, in over 100 something countries, and in the span of like 10, 15 years. So for sure that helps shape a lot of who I am and just my visual culture and even personal culture.
I remember also, I think I saw a post about this, which I found very like classy act. I think your father had a huge collection of art book and they were given away to a museum or library in Morocco or something. Is it correct or?
Yeah, the university in Morocco, yeah, the University Mohammed IV, and yeah, it's one of the biggest monography collection in France, if not in Europe. My parents pretty much, it's a bit what I will be about to say is both of my parents, their common passion was art collecting and traveling, so they did that a lot, and that's also what I've been doing mostly last year. We had in the last 3 years we sold off nearly 600 artworks, and I've been mostly dealing with that since my father passing. I've been managing the collection, cataloging it, finding the right sales partner.
I think the first time we met was in Dubai,
Yeah.
22. How did you enter? I mean, it's clear how you entered in the art world. How did you enter in Web3? I don't know many people go from traditional art to Web3 and not the other. It's more the other way around, actually.
Yeah, I have an explanation for everything. I have a backstory for all of that. I'll tell you about that. But my journey into like art and blockchain started like way back in 2016, 17, which was not that many people back then. It was pretty much like Jason Bailey, Eleonora Brizzi, Serena Tabachi, a couple of people like that that were around, like Fanny as well. But so it was a very, very small group of people of interest and mostly academics. And I was fascinated by counterfeiter actually. I've always read book about counterfeiter or the counterfeiter of Vermeer, of César. And I don't know, there's a bit of this fascination for like white collar criminal detective. And when you read about the stuff, you realize that there's a problem in the art world with fakes, with traceability, provenance, money laundering, authentication, and the blockchain solved pretty much all of those problems. So that's how I got into it, is really.
Then really into collecting you got later on as this scene started taking shape, or?
Yeah, collecting, I've mostly collected as a teenager things from our travels around the world. So sometimes some of the things we place with travel a lot with the boat was Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, pretty much those places in island in the Pacific, where you still have culture there that are very roots and almost like feels like they live in another time, right? They're still very close to their roots and practice. NFT, I started, with mostly Nifty Gateway and Raribles. The first crypto art project I bought was the I Am a Coin project from Kevin Abosch, which was 20, basically. It was like, it's not the first artist to tokenize himself, but back then there was a bit of what was told. And so that was like the first like conceptual crypto art type of project. And NFTs really came by to me with Raribles and Nifty Gateway. And at a point where I've had a bunch of time on my end, and everything was very cheap, so I collected a bunch. And when prices started to increase to the point that, I, at 25 years old, could not really follow up with, I did mostly curation, organizing exhibition. The first exhibition I did was in 2021, and the topic was about how to use NFT as a tool of emancipation in countries that are either in war or under dictatorship. So it was an exhibition that had featured a lot of artists from Lebanon, from Kurdistan, from places like that in the world where there's either a lot of fear against the state and the collapse of the banking system in Lebanon, for example, and for the Kurdish artist, a state control sort of ethnic cleansing that has been going on for decades. And so a lot of those artists, they managed for the first time to be able to make art that was seen by the world under their real name through and thanks to NFT. I think that that's one of the big things that is very fascinating about NFT is that you don't need to be living in Paris, London, and New York anymore to be able to make it. As an artist, you can live from pretty much anywhere in the world because you get access to that worldwide village over the internet of people. And so to them, it was a way for them to survive. And there was this fascinating story by one of the artists of the show called Bagher Kaya, which had to flee the war against ISIS in Syria. And of course, if he sold all of his assets and take cash or gold or silver or whatever, he would have got ripped off or stolen at the first border control. He had to travel through several countries of war as a refugee. So he changed it all into Ether. At the moment where I think Ether was like right before COVID, so it was like $300 or $400 perhaps. And by the time he got into I think while he was in Syria or traveling through, he bought like a CryptoPunk for a couple of ETH. And by the time he was in France, his crypto portfolio was like 7-figure. So he had this weird paradox of being a refugee, political refugee and asylum, while pretty much being a crypto millionaire at the same time, which to me was a unique story that was interesting to showcase in this art fair, which was specialized in artists from Middle East and North Africa. So I always try to do shows that, goes beyond just the basic techniques. Like, it's not like going to be a show about animation or photography. It's always going to be a show about a more overarching thematic that either talks about a specific tension, paradox, or try to explore at least a concept that, you need a curator to put forward. And I think that's where the added value of curation is. I've always been against making curation as selection. A lot of things we call curation in our space is often just merely selection of artists, which
Selection of the
is
highest price often too, just like a best.
perhaps or even populist. Sometimes the most famous or the most popular are not the best selling or the most priced, but selection has surely some populist aspect to it. Even if you I'd made a couple of threads about that, about being in juries of selection for art prize and stuff like that. And when I realized is that a lot of people do think that when things are decentralized and make it as a committee, you have a more objective selection. But my argument was that it's not more objective, it just is more consensual. So you're just landing on the artist that everybody agrees on, and usually that's the sort of minimum the denominator factor, which, to me, curation is not about finding what's the most consensual. It's finding the artists that have the most interesting intent and the most, critical thinking about their practice. And so I've always been the odd ones out trying to defend the artists that not everybody was agreeing on, and saying that, the point is not for us to all agree. It's just for us to be able, from our own subjectivity, to push forward a specific artist that have a narrative that we think is strong enough or interesting enough to be showcased or selected for a prize, for example. So yeah, curation, I take curation very seriously. So I've always been trying to do that very professionally and critique at least the process that exists toward that, because we're always talking about legitimacy, but the question is always like, who really can decide of who's legitimate or not, and under which characteristic do you make that process?
Yeah, it's a super interesting approach. I mean, I think it's a very good explanation of what curation means, because as you mentioned, but it's very often people think like curation equals gatekeeping, which is much more about giving like a narrative and putting the work inside the narrative you want to explore. So that's very interesting. I hope we'll see more shows that you curate very soon.
Okay.
And it also made me think about a post you tweeted, a couple of them actually, that you posted on X recently. The first one was about like the gallery services. I don't know if there's such a thing, but like when a gallery is representing an artist, all the collection of the stuff they do, which I found extremely interesting. And I was even like, are they really doing all of that? So of course, I mean, the whole thing was, I don't know, going from, I don't know, like being like a psychotherapist somehow to bringing food. I don't know. Can't remember exactly, but it was, and creating and finance, and I mean, managing the entire life of the artist. I found that quite fascinating, and hopefully we can see this in Web3 someday. Well, not now, because obviously we have more galleries shutting down than taking care very well with artists. But the other one, and my point is this: you also offer a lot of free portfolio reviews, I believe, and I think you stopped because you had some people just like not showing up. And this is clearly not, because I mean, we are very lucky to have people like you in the space, you're very young but extremely experienced in many aspects. And for me, it highlights, I think we have a problem about professionalism in the space, where, I mean, so many things are dealt in a very unprofessional way that found this very disturbing. So I don't know, maybe you have another view, another take on this, but I would love to hear your thought about that.
Yeah, my take is that I don't think that's necessarily so specific to Web3. I think that could be largely said about the art world. When I was like interning in a lot of auction houses, gallery, I was very surprised how amateurish a lot of the things were done, and the approach, even like just in terms of perhaps data protection, or even just how they price things sometimes, or they just approach selling. So I think, it's a market where you say most of the gallery close. It's the same thing in traditional art. I think 75% of gallery that opens close within the first 3 years that they exist. The one that survive usually are galleries that do not need to make a profit to survive. They are run by people that are privileged enough to do it as a hobby. And that's perhaps one of the problem in the art world, is that on one side, you have people that are very professional and want to take things very seriously. And on the other side, a lot of the big stakeholders are people that are treating art as a hobby, something to gain a bit of social and cultural capitals from the masses or from a small circle of people. And so they're doing it for the fun. And so when you're doing things for the fun of it and just the fun of it, you tend to not treat it as at such a high standard as you could expect from I would say, some of a professional approach. And the list of the things that I've put in as what galleries usually do. Well, first, there's variety of typology of gallery. Of course, your seaside gallery that sells painting of little boats, not gonna do a lot of those. That they say sells painting of little boats. So they have a seafront gallery, as we call them. Some gallery are often don't even have its space, and they only operate over the phone. There is a book about I think it's Georgina Adams that wrote a books about like the hidden side of the art world that explain those different typology of gallery. And a lot of the time, when artists says, "Oh, I've been rejected by so many galleries in my life," and when I ask them which gallery did you apply to, I usually check those galleries and realize that, of course, they got rejected because those galleries had nothing to do with the type of artwork they're doing. Sometimes they were even fully secondary market gallery, so they don't even represent living artists. So why would you apply there? It's a bit like the people that sends their CV to 100 job and be like, "Oh, nobody responded to me." It's just because you've sent the same CV that is not tailored to the job you're trying to get. That's pretty obvious. So yeah, and honestly, this sort of amateurism that some people might think it's specific to Web3, tend to find it with any type of artist, regardless or not if they're digital artist or artist involved with Web3, really. It just is, a field of work where sometimes you blur like vocation and profession and passion. So usually there's always go beyond like I would say the healthy line between job and personal life. And so a lot of those things just get mixed up and end up being very emotional and difficult to deal with. But I really do not think that's necessarily specific to Web3. If anything, some typology of digital artists are very high professional. When I'm dealing with 3D artists, often there are artists that are or animator artists. Usually those are artists that are familiar with working with big agency on big production with tight deadline, making crunch and stuff. So those guys know how to deal with contract or to act and produce fast if need be. And so they're very like high standard professional. It's not the same way I have to deal with perhaps a photographer or another type of medium. So there's so many I would say it's difficult to make general statement about the art world because there's so many nuances and specificity. That's also why it's so fascinating. That's one of the reasons why I'm both fascinated by blockchain and art is because those are two subjects that you can spend your entire life trying to learn about, and you will never know everything that is to be known. There's so many things that it's just like a unlimited source of curiosity, which is what I've always been looking for in my life. I think curiosity is the main quality you gotta have to be a good artist, a good collector, a good curator. It's the, I would say, the common denominator of everyone in that world and space.
When I ask you about curating and selecting, when I just select or whatever comes to the top of your mind, some of your own favorite moments of collecting, like say in the heyday or in your journey through the beginnings till now in Web3, like
Well, I had a pretty lucky and exciting first experience because the first NFT I ever bought, that was a proper RC21, 721 and all that, was the Beeple Genesis piece, which you could get for $4. And I got it on drop for $4, and I still have it to this day. So that's likely the best dollar ever invested in history, I think. Pretty much little to no risk to just being very crazy. Within a couple of months, I think this work was already worth like 40, 30, 40,000. So everybody was thinking I'm crazy not to sell it. And a lot of people still that I'm very crazy for never having sold it so far. It's still the most valued artwork in my collection, and it is an artwork that is oddly very difficult to look at. There's like this sound thing of it's like a bullshitting itself, and it's terrible aesthetically. It's not meant to be a beautiful artwork. But it was funny because this artwork really encompassed, I think, what was the main medium in the like cycle of late 2020, which was mostly 3D art animation, 3D artist. That was a lot of like what Ekaidza, which was the curator of Nifty Getaway back then, was into. So a lot of that shows into what was curated on that platform back then. And this work of people is therefore one of the only few animated artwork that was fully made on 3D, and it was really like a representation of a snapshot almost of what was going on back then at that time. And a lot of those works that I go back to in my collection, I can often tie them to a period, a moment where this was the tendency, this was the hype, or this specific moment, this specific artist. And yeah, I always like to look at my collection in this way. And someday I would love to do like an exhibition where I use my collection as a way to sort of define or at least explore part of what has been going on in the last 5 years in NFT, because I think it's a interesting history that is very dense and where narratives tend to trump each other all the time. And so it's constantly rewritten for sometimes for personal gain and not the right reason of like academic historical practice. So yeah, having my own subjectivity on that and being able to tell at least some sort of a subjective take on what I objectively consider to be the history of NFT would be an interesting project for me to at one point to do. But yeah, it's a bit of like a passion project, and I don't really sell my collection anyway, so it would be an exhibition that would just be run at loss pretty much. So yeah, I'll do that when I have the opportunity, but yeah, this is some of the highlight time would be this first buy, and then after I went into like the entire tunnel and rabbit hole of it. So it's difficult to remember specific moment, but I remember the inception of Ikenunk, Tezos, being able to connect Tezos, where I was at the time already getting priced out from what the market was back then, and so to me, Tezos helped me a lot into continuing this sort of accumulative collecting practice. My typology of collector is very much the one of an accumulator. When I see something that I like, I tend
what
to
does
want.
that mean? You just go
Yeah,
emotional based.
yeah. I've made a sort of a Venn diagram about what I consider to be the 5 different typology of collectors. One of those typologies is like the collector, which is like a collector with a rational practice in his collecting. If you're someone that is collecting, let's say, like my parents were collecting artwork from French contemporary artists from the 60s to the 80s, span over 3 movements that we call narrative, figuration, free expression, and support surface. And they will collect artists from those 3 movements because the thesis was making a collection around those movements in this period. And sometimes they will even buy artwork that they did not connect with, but that they bought nonetheless because they were an important part of making this collection thesis exist. And whenever you have this type of collectors, they are collectors that the sum of all the part of their collection is like the whole is greater than the sum of all its part, right? So if you take all the work in itself and added the value, then you have the investor collector, right? Someone that buys things because he do consider that those will go up in value over a certain period of time. The accumulator is more of a emotionally driven person. I myself had almost like a mild condition of the Diogenes syndrome where I just accumulate stuff all the time, even trash, even worthless thing, until I know what to do with them. When I was a student, I was like 18, 19 years old. I was studying in Roubaix in the north of France. And there they have a big glass bottle of Cokes. And I'm a big fan of Coca-Cola and just the visual culture around this brand. And so for some reason, I was buying those glass bottle of Coke and never throwing them off. And I had like this entire drawer with like 400 bottles. At some point, I had a friend come at my place and he opened my drawer. He was like, what the fuck is that? Like he was thinking I was very crazy, which I was a bit. And at some point, I managed to find something to do with those glass bottles. I made like some sort of sculpture with it. So that was always my way. Art was a way for me to, through some sort of creative discussion process to free myself from this accumulation thing. And digital art helped me a lot because now I can accumulate stuff without clogging my living space, right? It does just take space on my hardware, which I'm fine with. Before that, I had stuff everywhere in my drawers. There's barely any place for my clothes or my stuff. So yeah, that's one thing. And then just to finish on those like typology of things, of course not. You can be at the crossroad of various typology, but the collectors, the rational collector, the investor, the accumulator, and then you have the philanthropist, right? The person that buy artwork to support artists. And then the last one that we know very well is just like the scalper slash, flippers is one typology of collector as well. You just buy to sell fast at a profit. But yeah, so we all have a bit of everything within ourselves when we're a collector, but I think some typology or some person in our space tend to be more close to one typology or another. Typically Basilius, I think he's both a philanthropist and an investor. He did make buys that were smart and they were looking forward, market dynamics. But most of his collector journey was motivated by the love of artists and supporting art. So yeah.
One thing to ask, Jean-Jacques, you also collect as an artist. How do you identify yourself? What do you see?
I identify as a Prius.
Yeah, I get that. Apache helicopter is really...
So I have a friend who has this sticker on his like very much polluting car. So it always made me laugh. Sorry for that. I'm more like the impulsive. I would say I completely agree that I think we all have some of these traits inside all of us. The flipper, definitely not. That's not something, depending on the time frame, but not for me. I'm more like the impulsive kind of collector, where if I like the work and I can afford it, I will definitely go for it. Of course, sometimes I also collect to support other artists, but when I do so, it's not just for supporting them and blindly buying stuff. I do it because I love the work. So for me, it's important to support other people, but it's not like blind support. So it's a mix of, I would say, compulsive buys and sometimes I would say a bit more strategic buys, as in like helping out or supporting a gallery sometimes. So yeah.
Yeah, that's the investor mindset. Investor is not a bad word, right? It's like when I'm investing in someone, it's like I believe in someone, I want to support their career and support their growth. It's not necessarily tied to a financial, incentive. Investing is a broader word to that, but yeah, I would definitely put you somewhere at the cross section between an accumulator and an investor. I would say that I think as time went, a lot of the collector practice in our space has matured a lot. A lot of people that were there at first as flippers have moved toward more of an investor mindset or even some philanthropist. So it really depends, as it's not something that end up being fixed. It's evolving and we all like sort of gravitate toward one point or another depending on a lot of factors really.
From your experience, it's a rare quality that you are extremely knowledgeable and experienced regarding the art world, traditional art world, and very early in digital art. I mean, how do you see the evolution and the coexistence of like both?
Yeah. I think it's funny because I often says that I tend to believe most people tend to believe that the trad art world's going to buy our bag at some point, right? It's a common saying. I do think it's the opposite. I think that the people that buy NFT today are going to be the one that's going to buy the trad art bag later on. Why is that? It's a matter of generation. The average age of, I would say, an important collector in trad art is between 65 and 75 years old, at least for the bell curve of it. Of course, it goes, I would say, as early as 45 years old in millennials and stuff, but the big part of it are people in their mid 60s, mid 70s. I know we're making progress in medicine, but realistically speaking, those people are going to be gone or at least retiring from collection by 10 to 15 years, right? And some of the most reason why people sell the collection is for three factors: is moving houses, dying, and divorcing. And so, there's been more and more divorce, but that's beside the point. Just dying is a big factor into why you people sell the collection. And data shows that sons and daughters of existing collectors are not interested by their parents' collection. So a lot of it just end up being liquidated to the market through auction houses generally. Also because it's very difficult to calculate, intense tax based on artwork because the value is difficult to establish. And who has the authority? But yeah, there's also fiscal reason to that to some extent. But when you look at our space, there's not that many people that are my age or younger, but most people are between 35 to 45 really. So when I think about my involvement in Web3, I'm thinking I could spend a lot of time trying to, convince trad art collectors, but I can realistically speak and work with them for the next 10 years, if less. Whereas Web3 collectors, they're going to be there for at least 20 to 30 years. So that's a much reliable on time. And so I think that the evolution is going to be a generational replacement. As the old guard of the trad art world dies off, it's going to be replaced, and it's going to be replaced by the younger generation. And it's been proven by data that this younger generation has, for the vast majority, bought digital art. And this will, I think, with time, will likely sort of end up lobbying toward a broader adoption of digital art in the trad art world, because this is not going to be the same trad art world that it is today. It's going to be a different one from 20 years from now. But one of the things I was surprised by recently, I would say, is that I realized that for once, the public sector of the art world is moving faster than the private one. We've seen many museums adopt NFT showing digital art, the MoMA acquiring Toledo, LACMA, Centre Pompidou, and many others that I even won in Vienna, many others that I miss. But try to think of how many big trad art gallery has represented a Web3 artist or accept crypto. None. And they have artists that are unrepresented that could, represent a pretty easy onboarding tool. You don't even have to find collectors, they already have those. But, you look at artists like Xcopy, never really had a proper solo show until recently with Super Art. It's one of the best-selling artists, he never did any exhibition. In trad art, that seems like weird. And people and stuff like that, themselves, they don't even work with big gallery. They could join Gagosian or Zwinner or all those big gallery pretty easily, but they don't. I don't really know why. But I think those galleries are not that interested in representing those artists either. Funny enough, trad art institution, public sector, which is usually known to be very slow, has been moving faster than the private sector, and that is very surprising, and that shows perhaps that again, this is a matter of generation, because the gallery owners are pretty old folks in general, and so they don't necessarily have the energy to go out of their way and go and see things that are interesting. But in museum, they know that digital art brings the crowd. Some of the most visited places in Paris for art is the Atelier des Lumières, which doesn't even have any artwork in its collection. It's just projection mapping, and it registers more entry than museum like the Musée d'Orsay that has masterworks. Truly, I can see it even from kid experience. You see the kids that goes out of museum, they're like, Mom, Dad, when we go home, they're complaining all the time. And when you go to the immersing places, they're just running around, having fun, being very impressed. And so, yeah, digital art in that regard, for the valorization of monuments, patrimonial, or even as a third place for activation of art experiences, has shown that it's very strong to drive public interest. So maybe this interest is commercial from the institution. They know that if they show digital art, they're going to bring crowds. If they talk about AI, they're gonna bring, people interested by those topic. Sometimes it's done in a gimmicky way, sometimes it's done in the right way. That might be one of the explanation. Yeah, that's some of the things that I've been sort of realizing recently with my experience going to Miami and stuff, about like what's going to be about the future. It seems like, yeah, institution is taking a more and more important role in our space, which is great because we tend before to confuse private entity with institution. Sotheby's typically, Christie's, we used to also refer to them as institution, right? As if you're going to be at Sotheby's and Christie's, there's some sort of an accomplishment in your career in Web3. It's funny because it's not the case in trad art at all. If anything, most artists will try to avoid as much as possible having their work go up to auction, and gallery will often try as well to shadow bid to raise the price, because as soon as something goes up to auction, you lose the control over your primary market price. So you don't want your thing to go on auction, because now people think like, why would I buy your work for 15,000 at your exhibition if I can just buy it for 5,000 at the auction houses? Are very high in
The
demand.
point is, in digital art, you get that you don't necessarily need an auction house for the liquidity.
Exactly.
If there's
And
a
the image is
demand,
very different.
OpenSea is better than any auction house, if you ask my opinion.
Indeed.
Because we didn't see any Web3 auctions which attracted new sorts of buyers that were, maybe I would say 90% of the people who are using OpenSea were buying also at Sotheby's or Christie's again.
Yeah, well, so OpenSea you can only list, right? There's an auction feature, but it's barely used.
Yeah.
But that was I was going to is that liquidity is a big promise with artwork, where you feel like the liquidity is not the demand is not that high, right? But when you have, major artwork, the Goose of Cherniak was a great NFT to be put up at auction houses because there was a lot of demand for it. So then when there's a lot of demand, there's what you call the magic of auction happening sometimes, where, there's a bidding battle, and OpenSea doesn't
Even think
really.
about the Goose, if I may enter.
Yeah, the Goose, well,
That was
I
$6
was,
million, right, for a Demon Cherniak ringer.
wasn't it much more?
I'm going to look it up.
I had like a 20 something figure in mind, but I might be wrong about that. To me, it's interesting. I was never big on generative art. I do like it from a conceptual standpoint, but the generative art I like is figurative because my taste is figurative art. I tend to struggle connecting with abstract production. And so to me, what happened with the Goose was very interesting because that was like the singularity occurrence of a figurative output being made in a collection that is vastly abstract in nature. Some people would say that just like, basic phenomena, like we call I think, paralleloid, right? Where you see faces in things where there's no faces. So which is funny because last time I was discussing with someone I think that was doing a thesis on NFT or something, about this notion of rarity, right? This in collection of 10K and large collection, long form collection, you have this notion of rarity that justify paying a premium from the floor. But if you look at the Goose, there's, a rarity in the sense of the occurrence of a figurative output being generated by a largely abstract model. But from the traits point of view, from a purely mathematical standpoint, the Goose is not a rare ringer. It's not a ringer with rare traits. It's a pretty basic ringer. It just has this singularity of occurrence, which is interesting because the long form generative art aspect was truly a revolution to my view, because I've never seen before that people buy artwork that they did not know what it was going to look like whatsoever. I think that's a very unique thing to do, right? You're going to spend thousands of euros sometimes on something that you don't even know is going to look like. And I was never really comfortable with that because I tend to know what I buy, and would always be, I guess I was always think that I was going to be disappointed from the experience because I just like to buy the thing I like. And if you give me something randomly, I'm like, oh, sure, I might not have the same connection with that in some ways. I've changed over the time on that experience. They've been like, even before Tyler Hobbs, QQL, there was a couple of generative art collection where you could sort of roll the dice to have to sort of preview the output and mint the one that you liked. This was, I think, interesting because you can explore the potentiality of the algorithm. That's what is beautiful, is that I was telling that to my students is that the challenge of making a 10K collection is to have something that is as diverse as cohesive in the same time. It's a very unique equilibrium and tension and paradox where you want to have very diverse output, but also something that you can guess from a first glance which collection they are part of or which artist made it. So it's a very difficult task, I think, and that's only crunched down to having 10 million possibility and only boiling it down to 10,000. I'm not a generative artist myself. I mean, Jean-Jacques will be able to tell us much more about that. But to me, that was the magical aspect of it, and I think that's why the Goose has so many people being excited about it because that brought the notion of rarity outside of mathematical rarity and more of like a human subjectivity on rare occurrences,
If
singularity in a way.
I'm honest, and I don't mean to hate on 6529,
Cool.
but it felt like a marketing stunt and a market making strategy, because things are over a long time now, things have been on a downtrend, and to have usually the market making is you make a big price for the number one item and then you make on the bottom, and we all know that he owns quite a lot of JPEGs and he has funds and this and that. So it seems like a market making strategy, and that makes it immediately unappealing. I think the number one fact why a lot of the private market, rich people, they're like, oh yeah, crypto hustlers, and it's just about the price and it's the apes and things like this. It's sort of like this image in a lot of this like high net worth society of that's why things haven't been working out the way we want to. If you ask my opinion, I think it's the
Yeah,
like image. Jean-Jacques, you want to say something about the goose or no?
No, I found very interesting because I never looked at it this way, as in it's a non-technical trait. It's more like a vision of when you see something figurative, and that making it more attractive for example, people like you, Brian, who are more to collecting figurations. So it made me, made me thinking about how to implement this. But even though the paradox is it's not a feature, so
yeah, that's
it would
right.
have to
It's
be.
also what makes it magical, right? It's difficult to achieve willingly, right?
But an interesting problem to solve, indeed. So yeah,
But on
but
your
beyond
point,
that,
Nicola, of like buying artwork for flex, pretty much is what you're saying, right? Marketing or whatever. It was the same thing with Justin Sun, right? Buying the banana. It's funny because everybody talked about Justin Sun when he bought the banana for what was like 10 million or something, 2 million. But nobody talked about him when he bought a Giacometti for 80 million 4 years ago. And it's a really little known story, but so I heard from Christie's folk that Justin Sutton bought this Giacometti artwork for 80 million, which was a record amount, and that he didn't even know who Giacometti was the morning of buying this artwork at the auction. And nobody really talked about it, but that also goes to my point that surely at some point crypto collectors will be buying trad art. But one of the reasons, when you look at what's going on in the art markets, especially about who owns auction houses, you realize that all the big auction houses are either owned or have been owned by a French billionaire. Patrick Drahi owns Sotheby's, Pinot owns Christie's, Arnaud used to own Philips. And the reason for that, I think, goes down to a theory that a French sociologue put in a word called Jean-Jacques Bourdieu. I'm sort of putting a spin on the theory because it's more about inheriting social, cultural capital from your parents and why is it that, children from privileged background are better at school is because, of course, they've inherited from a lot of cultural background from the parents. But I do think that rich people do tend to make arbitrages and trade-off between their financial capital and their social and cultural capital. And we used to be in a space where in crypto, people had a lot of financial capital, but they were misfits, right? They were not considered socially that much, and they were considered just here for those weird crypto money things and not smart or not cultivated, etc. And I think that the artistic ecosystem brought an opportunity for a lot of the crypto folks to be able to say, look, I'm also in for the culture. I like art. I have some taste. I do, make connection with that. And so I do think that what NFT has provided is connection. And so what you say marketing and flex is just them arbitrating, trading off financial capital to gain social clout or cultural capital. which has been the strategy of 6529 for years. It transformed this social and cultural capital into the meme card collection, for example. If it did not have done that, if it launched a similar initiative without the 6529 brand, would that have worked as well? I don't necessarily think so. So you need to have people that gain those sort of capitals to make the artwork goes. That's what I think makes the artwork goes. And that's also one of the reasons why, with the emerging of social media, art is no longer an asset that is so much in desire by the high net worth individual, because we've shifted from a society where you wanted to be appealing to a small social circle of privileged people of your industry, perhaps, to being known on social media by the masses. So nowadays, if you want to have social capital and get the opportunity to have cultural stuff, you gotta be followed by the masses. And, the masses doesn't know who Rothko is, but they surely know what a Lamborghini is. So if you have 200,000 euros to spend to get some social clout, you're likely gonna spend it on a Lamborghini than a Rothko, because that's what's gonna get you the clout. And I think this is why of the reason that a lot of reports shows that younger high net worth individuals tend to spend much more money into the luxury industry, into the car industry, into the collectibles, than they are doing it in art. Because in the sort of red chip collector world, with those like collectible watches, bags, fashion, and all that, they are buying brand that have a mass consumer appeal that everybody knows because they are big brand. And that's also perhaps why a lot of artists are branding more and more themselves to become, so especially the artists that does like those toyish type of art, right? Like Oz, Orlinsky and all that. They are branding their art in a way that everybody can recognize it, because recognizability is what people are looking at to get those sort of social and cultural capitals. If that makes sense, it's a bit of a complex theory that I make my own, but yeah, it's a bit of personal interpretation.
I mean, no, it's to break it down. What you're saying is basically that this people. The NFT world is going to find more success with millennials who want to purchase this art for social clout, and not the boomer world who purchased, let's say, non-digital art or traditional, from the traditional world. They're going to keep sticking with them basically until they die.
Yeah, the idea is that social clout changed scale in the span of 50 years. Before social, you wanted to appeal to your own social circle and your own social demographic. Nowadays, you want to appeal to everyone. You want to be mass known, and
It's pretty simple. It's a difference between social networking and the networking people did 15, 20 years ago over, a cocktail.
even the notion of being famous. There's been social study that shows that 20 years ago, when you ask people, do you want to be famous or do you want to be rich? Most people would say rich. The newer generation, they answer that they want to be famous, because they know that with being famous, you can get money as well. Perhaps, who knows? But it's a shift of paradigm with generation that is interesting to take into account if you want to project how the art world's going to be in 20 years, 30 years from now. Even in terms of crypto adoption, like when I teach classes to students in their 20s, none of them care about crypto. And I came to understand why, because, you're born in 2008, but you are like 90 years old now. Even before that, let's say you're born post 2000. The likeliness of you remembering what the subprime crisis was is very little. And it's at, subprime crisis is at almost the genesis of the Bitcoin white paper and crypto. It was this defiance toward the global financial system and this need of having a solution to be that is decentralized and not dependent from the traditional finance world. And this sort of libertarian promises of a crypto revolution. Nowadays, these promises doesn't really make sense for the younger generation, because as much as they can remember, crypto has always existed for them. So it's not a revolution, it's part of just general life, right? And so they tend to struggle, at least in Occidental countries, with the narrative that we've been pushing for decades, that is like crypto libertarian, internet neutrality, zero knowledge proof and all that. But I do think, like, for instance, the future of crypto adoption is in Africa, because we have so many African that can have use for crypto, and they're just going to be like, I think, 2 billion African by 3040. So that's going to be like, I think, to me, the main objective and the main adoption issue is going to be African nation, developing nation, because in Occidental countries they just don't have the same problems. That's why I go back to like the first curation, first exhibition I did. If you're someone from Lebanon and you've lived through the explosion of Beirut port, and you realize that, you know, the money you have in the bank, the banking system collapsed there. You can have 100,000 of euros. If it's in your bank, it's gone. So, you know, in those countries, the defiance for the financial system and the banking system is not an hypothesis, it's the harsh reality. Same thing with just state control over private property and all that, you know. Those thematic which crypto and blockchain solves are the most strongest in those emerging countries, where yet the adoption is still very limited. So to me, that's really, yeah, is the big challenges. Same thing as for NFT adoption. There's only the marginal amount of people that owns crypto that buys NFTs. And most of the time we feel like, where are the buyers? Do we need to get those tryhard people to buy us? No, I don't think so. I think we need to get more of the crypto order to get into art, really, as it was at the beginning of this entire movement. I've been trying to onboard people from trad art collectors to NFTs, and the only one I've managed to onboard were the one that were collecting artists that were an interesting bridge toward digital art. Like you say, Solid, for example, that does like mathematical type-based art, or Balka, conceptual art collectors. But if you're a collectors of 19th century painting, there's nothing gonna be excited about in digital art, really. And they tell me, why would I collect something else? I already have plenty of fun collecting the things that I like. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. Well, why would I try to sort of bully you into adopting this new thing if, you know, you're having fun with what you're doing already? It's like trying to convince someone that goes to his work on a bicycle every day that he should buy a car. And you'd be like, yeah, the car goes much faster, the car goes much further, you know, it's much more technological advance. And he's like, I don't need a car. I can go to work on my bicycle. You're trying to convince me to buy a car. It's a bit like, yeah, this sort of realization I've made that each and all, the art world is very nuanced and broad. And so it's difficult to make a general statement about, hey, let's put NFT and blockchain everywhere because that's where it's supposed to be. To each and everyone their passion and their interest, and I think the interest for NFTs, for crypto art, for crypto culture is much more easier to market toward a crypto hoarder that don't have any NFTs than to trad art collector that don't have any crypto.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I
try to make some sense, but sometimes just me.
No, you do. You do. It's super interesting. I'm thinking you're sharing a lot of food for thought. Interesting. I mean, the Pierre Bourdieu approach was also very interesting. I had no idea. I understand a bit more now why the Vuitton bags become artworks, like the Yo-Yo Coussin. Like, they are. It makes sense now by the light of what you just said that, yeah, if people buy more luxury goods than art, that some brands try to combine both.
But even Murakami and Yayoi are very recognizable brand, right? Like Murakami is almost do more brand collaboration than exhibition these days. But yeah, it's the brandization of artists is another topic in itself, but is, I think, the tip of the iceberg of this, tendency toward more culturally largely recognized assets versus niche community of interesters, if that makes sense. But I think a lot of that, you know, I've always been trying, because I've lived most of my life on a boat when I was little, and then I went to boarding school in an international boarding school. I tend to have a very outside view of my own French culture. Like, I'm very French to many aspects, but I'm also not that French on many other aspects. And I've realized reading a lot of the French philosophers like Roland Barthes, like Baudrillard, etc., that those guys are often cited in digital art exhibition and history because they really developed, like French philosopher of the 60s, really did develop a lot of those notions that I think could be a great argument toward making digital art really more academically considered, right? I'm not gonna, I don't really know enough of those philosophers to develop a sensible thought process around it and explaining to you as easily as possible. I did make a little thread about that, but yeah, there's plenty of thought for thought when you look into French philosopher. For some reason, I don't really know why. And so, yeah, anyone that has an interest of philosophy, I often just advise them to just look up those work, because a lot of the ideas they were developing could be very much applied to the internet and to this just 21st century. Those guys were very in advance in terms of the impact of cultural assets on society and socially. So yeah, definitely really interesting. And also just even my own taste and my own perspective on things, because I've grew up surrounded by people from other nationality and I've grew up on a boat sailing across the world. You just end up, having quite a unique perspective and building up an eye. That's also, one of the things I have a bit of an advance. I'm young, but I've benefited from the cultural capital of my parents for once, and also the one of just my experiences. I've grew up in various places where aesthetic were different, people were different, motif, colors, many things were just culturally subjective. And that helped me at a young age to understand all those nuances that I think you generally end up learning about much later in your life.
The last question from my side, I'm wondering, like, what are you?
It's a bit of a question mark at the moment. As I told you guys, I used to work for the Sandbox DAO, so I was managing the NFT art collection. It was a pretty good project because the collection where I took over was about at the valuation of 2 million euros. So that's interesting to do. And buy artwork with money that's not yours is also a pretty good gig, to be fair. So I'm gonna publish tomorrow the last report of the mission, and I want to try to build up on this experience. As in the last, I would say, couple of months of year, we've heard a lot about the brokers on our space. Right? Brokers say, Eddie Shayman selling this, that, all the time. So I was like, oh, is it brokering something I want to do? So I was like, let's try to do some, and let's perhaps try even with my own artwork from people. I was like, just out of curiosity, asking broker how they were operating. And with the Sandbox DAO as well. And I realized that, there is a notion of it's hard to understand who brokers are loyal to, in a way, because they work for both the seller and the buyer. So when someone is in this position, you really understand what they're working for. But I feel like brokers are mostly working for whoever has the liquidity, so usually the buyer. And all the offer I had was like, reasonable offer, but not offer that I would accept because it is what it's worth, but it's not what I want from it. And for Sandbox, where I'm dealing with much more like PFP project and stuff, I realized that people that buy in bulk or broker usually sell things under the WEF bid of the collection, because if you want to sell 5-10 things, the WEF bid is just only a couple of them. So usually they sell for even less than the WEF bid. So I'm like, what's the point? And the point is that if you need to sell fast, those guys have the liquidity and they can get all of those out of your hand very fast. But in our space, we don't really have collection manager or art advisor that are there not to provide you with liquidity, but help you perhaps build up your collection or even clean off your collection to some point. That was a lot of what I was doing at the Sandbox. We had 1,300 something NFTs, and I've sold a lot of them going down to nearly 600. Because a lot of those things were just low value stuff, not interesting, long term, etc. And there was a vision, there was a strategy, and I think a lot of the collectors could benefit, especially when you see with what happened with Nifty Getaway, for example, where a lot of those high value artwork are still somewhere close in Nifty Getaway and perhaps will never be claimed. If you have someone that can sort of look up for you, not working on a commission base, but more on a fixed contract base, then, when you're not working on a commission, you put as much care into looking into the artwork that are worth a couple of thousand than the one that are worth tens of thousands. And that was the point with Sandbox, is like, they were asking me, why don't you just broker a thing? And I'm just like, I'm telling them, I will never broker things that are worth for $5, that doesn't make sense. But if I'm working on a fixed contract base, then I have as much interest to, take care of the low value artwork than the high value one. And I can think forward and sort of prevent you from having to just sell whenever you need liquidity. Because if you have a sense of urgency, you're just going to make the decision that you can make at the moment. But if you have someone that can help you perhaps see forward that and anticipate some of those risks, then you're making much more meaningful sales, and you can slowly and surely build up a collection that makes sense and that is in tune with your vision. I'm sure that all of the collectors, even the one that listen to the podcast, it's things that you look at your wallet and you'll go like, why did I even buy that back then? And there's almost like, because you have...
Through the accumulator, for sure, you'll have a few of those.
But, that's the thing, is that I myself have a hard time to sell my collection because I have an emotional attachment to it. But when I'm doing it for a client, I don't have the emotional attachment. I can tell you straight in the eyes, you bought something that is shit, or that is just not worth what you expect to be it worth this day. And so it's difficult to buy something for 90% loss, but sometimes that's the best decision. But our human brain and our bias tell us there's no way I can do that. There's no way it's a logical decision. For the sandbox, there's a lot of things I've sold for like minus 90% of it. A good thing I did, because nowadays they are minus 99. So it's so honestly just being able to also detach yourself from your own collection, from your own bias, and your own sort of pure sage decision. You gotta need to have an outside view for making those decisions sometimes. So it's something I would love to be able to do, but I don't think the space is as mature yet toward those type of practice. But we'll see. I'll try my luck around and see how that goes.
I have one last question. I was really surprised from your detailed macro overview and like how much thought you put into this. We are in this weird moment in time where we both were at Miami, and there was a lot of excitement. All three of us were at Miami. Excitement. It seems like people are buying. We're on the biggest stage and biggest art stage in the world. And it was sort of the energy is like, okay, now the crypto market just needs to come back a little bit and digital art is going to fly again. And at the same time, it's January and Nifty Gateway is closing without decentralized file storage. So, well, how do you see this, like this next couple months playing out in a, like, let's say, simulation?
I think it's just important to take like a step back. Thinking ahead a couple of months doesn't make sense. You gotta think ahead a couple of years, if not a couple of decades. That's the timeline of the art world and art history. That's not a couple of months. You gotta take a step back even just in terms of proportion. You know, sometimes I see those ludicrous claim that the digital art market's gonna reach a 1 trillion valuation, and that is just what we call the 1% bias. They think like, okay, if it's 1% of the overall market cap, then that add up to 1 trillion. That doesn't make sense. The entire art world is 50 billion valuation. So if they're saying like, okay, the digital art's gonna be worth then 50 times what the entirety of the art market is. And Art Basel is a good example of that. People were very excited and were like, okay, this is our moment. They made what, 3 million in sale for on the booth of the sector? There's one gallery, the highest selling artwork in the fair was 50 million. So one artwork sales was nearly 15 times more than the entirety of all of the sales of the digital sector. So that's where we are. Like we're not leading that. We're still at the beginning and the inception of this entire space. Our prices are very, very reasonable in comparison to the high-end contemporary art market. Even if you take the digital sector as one single entity, it was not even the top 10 of the biggest art sales of Art Basel. But we are, even outside of there's 10 artwork that sold more than the entirety of the digital sector of Art Basel. Did we heard about those? Not that much. It was only talked about within the field of professional. For the public, this is different. And I was going back to institution. We can tell that digital art is bringing interest from the crowds, from the public, from visitors. And I'm sure that, the people installation did sold a lot of ticket to Art Basel, to be fair. And that's what they were interested by. So yeah, step back and just realize that this space is just at its beginning. I remember in 2017, 2018, this space was nearly non-existent. Scopy was selling things for £2, 10 pounds. The CryptoPunks were going out for free. I mean, there was barely anyone that cared about the stuff back then. And people are like, well, it's dead. But to me, from my perspective, it's so much more alive than it was 8 years ago. And that seems like a long time, but it's not from the point of view of art history. It's very, very short time. So when I see what could have been achieved in 8 years, I'm thinking what can be achieved in the next 8 years. And I think that, yeah, we're going fast, we're going high.
The last question I have regarding this, I agree with your take. What I find a bit more worrying is that there's less and less interesting art sales. Like, I don't know how much you're collecting at the moment, but for liquidity reasons, my collecting obviously slowed down, but also I don't have FOMO and see a ton of things popping out that like, damn, this is really nice, this is really new. It's on the one side, I think when I look back, from my perspective as a collector, I go, oh, this was new, whether it's generative art, whether it was early AI art, whether it was just other digital art. There's a newness factor, and there was obviously all this emotion. Now I struggle to find places, yeah, that get me that excited.
I
What do
understand
you
what
have
you mean.
any? Yeah, do you see a lot of places, or am I missing those? Where are you?
What I think is going on is, it's funny because I did on Raster, I did the like 2025 wrap up, right? And it was like just how many things you bought, just like on Spotify. And I think I bought last year like 10 works at most, which is much less than I used to do. And I didn't even realize that I bought that, not that much, and didn't account for Tezos, but I was surprised by that myself. I was like, oh, I really did slow down into collecting. I think one of the reason, and going back to Nifty Getaway, is that nowadays most artists operate with Manifold, Transient Lab, with platform that give them a technical tool, right? But doesn't really manage the marketing. As much as we can be critical about the marketing involvement of platform like SuperR, Marketplace, and all that, there were companies that were doing marketing and that were trying to create an event out of a drop. This day, we don't really have that anymore because we expect artists to be great marketer. But I always say that if artists were great at marketing, they would work in marketing. They would not be an artist. They would be much more successful in marketing then. So I think that's also one of the reasons this space is getting less and less intermediated in ways that now a lot of those responsibilities fall into the hand of artists. And realistically speaking, artists does not have the same selling power as a platform like SuperR and NFT Getaway, even despite the best effort. So I think that's one of the reasons why before we just had to look up one or two specific platforms. They were things we were seeing because they were heavily retweeted, shared. The only few events, exhibition sales I've seen were done by SuperR with like Sema Simi, for example, a couple of months ago, which is an artist I work with, like myself. I try to sell those artwork of this artist. I did not manage because I didn't have to clientele, and SuperR comes in and sells pretty much 5 of his sculpture within a week. To me, it was like, am I just that bad? But no, I realized that it's just not comparable. I'm on my own. They are an entire company with funding. We just don't have the same firepower. So this day, that's why it's like there's not that huge company that has a firepower this day to get you excited. You are getting excited by marketing campaign, communication campaign that were tailored by a bunch of individual. Of course, one individual on his own is not going to have the same impact. So, even with fellowship, I guess that was one of the initiatives that was the most excited about. And thankfully, fellowship partnered with Artix Code because I think, there was a challenge with representation of artists as well. When you dealing with so many artists are very demanding about, you being, putting effort and time into their work. And when you have 50 and 500 artists, it's just not manageable. So I think, we gotta wait for that and we just have to look up for more curatorial initiative. This perhaps, that was my strategy, honestly, with my auction at Sotheby's that I was the most proud of, was called the Oddly Satisfying Auction, which was featuring 50 or 60 2Ds and 3D animators that were exploring the notion of oddly satisfying video. It was very successful from a communication standpoint of view because I had this group of 50, 55 artists that could make a huge communication push all together in the span of 2 weeks. If I had just a couple of artists, that wouldn't have been the same impact. So I think that just is the consequences of all those platforms shutting down. As much as we like to criticize them, they did created a lot of intent and context and excitement. And now that they're no longer there, this capacity of creating excitement has just much less financial resources than it used to have. And in your sort of iceberg point of view of that is just you not getting too excited about that. But I'm sure that if you had 15 hours a day to look up for exciting stuff online, you'll find exciting stuff for sure. We just tend to not see it as much this day because there's less of an echo chamber and just overall less resources toward communicating on those initiatives. But I may be wrong. There's just thought of that on my head because I never really thought about that.
Makes a lot of sense. If you spend less marketing dollars, there's less excitement.
Yeah, I think it's just about firepower. You can do so much on your own. That's why when I do those portfolio review with artists, I often try to use basic analogy. And one of the analogy was like you're trying to cross the Atlantic on a boat. You can do it on your own with a small boat. It's just gonna be much more mentally draining than if you have a 5-man crew on a, big catamaran boat that is meant to be crossing the Atlantic.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll have new platforms coming up. And of course, I'm personally saddened that when a platform is shutting down. So hopefully the model will evolve and we can find this.
You can sit with. What do you think of Foundation, Jean-Jacques? This potential shift. It didn't close, but it sold off. So it's gonna change a lot, especially with Black Dove having this art stream type of thing going on. I'm very curious to see how they're gonna try to reinvent the model. Even they're gonna try that, who knows?
Yeah, at least it's interesting. I found this interesting because it's a new approach somehow. So I don't know. I was surprised that Rodeo I think they announced Rodeo is like being shut down as well, which to me, I've never really used it, but found it like appealing from the outside because it's like very cheap from what I remember, cheap, affordable. Everyone can just it's kind of playful in a way. So I don't know. I think it's brave that people do experiment with this foundation movement. Why not? I'm looking forward to see it, and I'm sure that one day that we will find the proper mix between adoption, decentralization, broader appeal, not that niche. And if I go back, like people who like to brag about what they buy, for me, if I'm still thinking about the online presence, I still think the PFP is kind of exactly this. Like, I don't have any, but you can brag by having a CryptoPunk, and people cannot say anything about it, I believe, because you were either extremely wealthy or you were extremely smart and early. What's wrong with this? So to me, I see a PFP like this. For me, I show respect. I'm like, yeah, this is either someone who is successful, who is smart and early, or both. Or so. Hopefully this can come back, I think, in a way, in terms of digital identity and what you try to communicate across it.
Yeah. Don't want to take too much of your time again, but just, remember when I said about Lamborghini and buying bags and watches and all that? To me, the PFP market, and it shows in just data, is the watches market and the car market is brands, right? To me, even the CryptoPunks, they are portraiture and art in a way, but they are recognizable brands.
I think it's
that's why.
fascinating that I think there's a bunch of PFPs that I actually like. I think they're funny. I think they're interesting collections. For example, if you think about the regulars, do you know the regulars?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wouldn't be surprised in maybe 10, 20 years from now, or maybe shorter time frame, that people come back to some kind of vintage PFP, like we buy vintage furniture today, or why not?
I mean, I really like some of these PFPs that are kind of like cool artworks and stuff, but are obviously at the moment trending towards zero in price. What is that, $24? Thank you very much, Brian. I think there's a delay a bit.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much, yeah, Brian. So I'm sure the future will be extremely bright for you. You're passionate, very talented, sharp mind, hardworking. What else do you need?
Perfect.
Yeah, hope to see you soon, Brian.
Yes. Yes, same here.
Thank you.
See you soon and have a good evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.